The observation platform of the Stellaire Veritas hummed with the quiet efficiency that defined the Thracian hegemony. Below, the crimson-tinged nebula of the Cygnus Veil swirled like cosmic blood, a beautiful, deceptive backdrop to the diplomatic farce unfolding on the nearby orbital station, Nexus Prime. Xylos, chief xenolinguist and observer prime for the Thracian delegation, delicately adjusted the focus array of his ocular sensorium. His 3 primary eyes, arranged in a vertical trichotomy of obsidian lenses, narrowed slightly. "Report, Analyst Krell," Xylos murmured, his voice a series of resonant clicks and low-frequency vibrations that only the environmental translators rendered as smooth common galactic. Krell, a younger Thracian whose chitinous exoskeleton shimmered with nervous, agitated patterns, hovered nearby on his grav harness. "Observer Prime, the Terran vessel, designation Odyssey-class escort, remains stubbornly inert in the designated buffer zone. Their transponder profile is bafflingly minimal. Low energy signature, archaic shield harmonics, and, curiously, a near-complete lack of tactical data packets." Xylos extended a slender, 4-jointed manipulator, its keratinous tip brushing a shimmering holographic schematic of the human vessel. It looked, by Thracian standards, offensively crude. Blocky, blunt, and lacking the elegant, tapering lines of true starfaring civilizations. It resembled a metallic insect clumsily fused to a brick. Archaic is the key word, Krell. The hegemony's prognostic models place the Terrans at a technological parity equivalent to the mid-expansion era of the Cathar centuries, before the invention of molecular displacement drives. They possess combustion engines in their orbital transports. For the God's sake! Corell's carapace flashed a nervous, pale, uncertain gray. "Their history archive suggested rapid advancement, Observer Prime, yet their primary defense projection appears to rely on antiquated kinetic weaponry, augmented by a substance they termed surprised high-pressure water." Xylos shifted his weight, the internal hydrostatic skeleton adjusting to the gravitational pull of the observation deck. He activated a data feed projecting the intercepted schematics of the Terran primary ordnance. "The hydro cannons," Xylos sighed, the sound a low, almost sorrowful whistle. "A perfect metaphor for the Terran species, I think. An over-reliance on brute, unfiltered force, coupled with a profound misunderstanding of applied physics. The hegemony had encountered the Terran species, the humans, 3 standard cycles prior during the Outer Rim survey. The initial contact had been jarring, marked by baffling emotional volatility and an alarming lack of coordinated defense protocols. They were chaotic, loud, and intensely possessive of their small blue homeworld. The hegemony viewed the galaxy through the lens of systemic efficiency. Logic, structural integrity, and the elegant application of force were paramount. Humans seemed driven by impulse, biochemical surges they called feelings, and weapons that seemed designed more for spectacle than actual strategic attrition. "The hydro cannon, Krell," Xylos explained patiently, as if speaking to a particularly dull hatchling, "fires a projectile of super-pressurized H2O at relativistic velocities. It is, essentially, a glorified, extremely fast stream of liquid. Its primary effect is blunt kinetic impact, followed by catastrophic structural wetting, which invariably short-circuits any advanced circuitry not specifically shielded for aquatic environments. And they use this to deter us?" Krell clicked incredulously. They use it to maintain their territorial sovereignty, Xylos corrected. When the hegemony established the survey quarantine around the Sol system, the Terrans interpreted the deployment of 3 cruiser-class deterrents as an act of aggression rather than a necessary environmental isolation procedure. The hegemony wasn't malicious, they were simply thorough. They isolated volatile systems to study the threat vectors before deciding on integration or neutralization. Humans had reacted as if the quarantine itself was the attack. Their response was the deployment of 3 of these escorts, armed solely with the hydro cannons. The initial skirmish was humiliating for the Terran forces. Their projectiles were easily deflected by the passive resonance field of the Axiom cruiser, turning the water into superheated steam almost instantly. 2 ships were disabled by secondary systems overload from the resulting plasma bursts. "Then why the caution now, Observer Prime?" Krell asked, hovering closer, his antennae twitching with genuine worry. "Why did the Grand Council permit this Nexus meeting if the Terrans are so easily dismissed?" Xylos tapped the schematic again. "Because of the ammunition. That is the crux of the problem. The Terrans do not generate the ammunition on board through complex molecular synthesis, Krell. They store it. They bring it with them." This was the source of the hegemony's lingering discomfort. A species that relied on bulk transport of its primary weapon propellant suggested a fundamental difference in resource management. Everything the hegemony used, energy, structural composites, even specialized solvents, was synthesized in situ, drawing energy directly from the quantum vacuum or ambient stellar radiation. Hauling liquid water across interstellar distances was monumentally inefficient. They are carrying disgusted, literal puddles, disgusted, Observer Prime, Krell said, his tone heavy with derision. "Indeed, and the data packets we intercepted show the Terrans treating this propellant with reverence. They run constant diagnostic checks on the storage tanks. They even have specific, highly guarded protocols concerning the integrity of the fluid. They seem to fear contamination more than external attack." Xylos recalled the analysis compiled by the Behavioral Studies Division. Humans, for all their technological primitivism, possessed a bewildering relationship with their own biology. They were soft, highly susceptible to microbial invasion, and possessed an almost fanatical obsession with hygiene and intake purity. It suggests, Krell, that the liquid itself is more than just a kinetic medium. It is precious. Perhaps it is a necessary catalyst for their localized energy shielding, or maybe it serves some unknown psycho-spiritual function integral to their operational capacity. The hegemony had tried to replicate the substance. They took a sample of the propellant, a cloudy, slightly viscous fluid recovered from a disabled escort, and ran it through standard Thracian spectral analysis. The results were baffling. Water, high concentrations of dissolved minerals, trace amounts of organic compounds, amino acids, simple sugars, fatty lipids. Basically, highly polluted, biologically active swamp water, filtered and pressurized. They are using slightly dirty water as a weapon, Observer Prime, Krell summarized flatly. It defies every tenet of logical warfare. Precisely. And that defiance is what warrants our continued study. We observe the Terran delegation now. They are entering the Nexus concourse. Note their physiological presentation. On the main view screen, the docking clamps hissed open. 3 figures disembarked from the Terran shuttle. They were bipedal, covered in strangely patterned synthetic textiles, and moved with a stiff, almost jerky gait. Their head morphology was remarkably uniform. A single, large sensory organ flanked by smaller auditory receptors, protected by thick, filamentous keratin growth. Xylos felt the familiar, subtle aversion that all hegemony members felt when viewing naked human physiology. They were so unprotected. No natural armor plating, no reflective scales, no adaptive camouflage. Just soft, vulnerable tissue, encased in permeable membranes. Look at their faces, Krell. The constant tension around the mouthparts. They are showing distress, even in a controlled environment. The pressure differential in the docking bay, though perfectly calibrated to their archaic atmospheric expectations, is clearly agitating them. They look perpetually hungry, Krell noted, wrinkling his mandibles in distaste. Or perhaps perpetually thriving under suboptimal conditions, Xylos mused, a flicker of professional curiosity overriding his species' inherent distaste. The three humans were met by the lead diplomat from the Viridian Pact, Ambassador Gnar. Gnar was a towering being of crystallized silicon, moving with slow, stately grace. The contrast was stark. The shimmering, patient intelligence of the silicon life form against the hurried, fleshy anxiety of the humans. The primary human delegate, a female designated Commander Eva Rostova, extended an appendage, a 5-digit manipulator, and offered it for the traditional Viridian contact greeting, a gentle transfer of static charge. Gnar, ever the diplomat, complied. Xylos watched the energy transfer on the monitors. The human skin, shockingly warm and vascular, accepted the charge, but Commander Rostova's posture remained rigid. She is compensating for Gnar's inherent psychic resonance dampening fields, Xylos explained, a crude method of maintaining neurological equilibrium during high-stress negotiation. Notice the subtle clenching of the phalanges. The delegation proceeded into the central negotiation hall. Xylos directed the optical arrays to focus on the cargo they had insisted on bringing. 4 large, heavily reinforced containers, labeled in angular Terran script. Hydrocannon ammunition, do not contaminate ingest. The irony is almost painful, Xylos whispered. They bring the means of their own destruction to the negotiating table. For the next several hours, the proceedings were typical. Thracian appeals for adherence to sector governance protocols, Viridian calls for measured neutrality, and human defiance cloaked in appeals to self-determination and inalienable rights. The crux of the standoff was the hegemony's demand for open inspection of the Odyssey-class escort's core systems. The humans refused, citing proprietary security regarding their drive matrix, a matrix, Xylos suspected, based on inefficient fission reactions and steam-powered turbines. Ambassador Gnar finally signaled frustration, his crystalline structure emitting a high-pitched, grating whine that momentarily overloaded the station's internal dampeners. "Terrans," Gnar resonated, his voice translated into a slow, deliberate cadence. "Your refusal to permit oversight on vessels entering controlled space is interpreted as concealment of prohibited armament. We require assurance that these hydrocannons are not merely kinetic delivery systems for biotoxic agents." Commander Rostova stepped forward, her expression unreadable beneath the heavy brows. "Ambassador, Hegemony Observer Xylos, we have stated this plainly. The hydrocannon is an extension of our naval doctrine. It is purely kinetic, utilizing inert, pressurized H2O. There is no toxicity, no prohibited payload, save for the standard mineral impurities inherent in Earth source water. And yet, Xylos projected from the observation deck, his voice entering the negotiation chamber with cold authority. You treat this inert substance as though it were fissile core material. You guard it with your most elite personnel. Why such surprised, disproportionate security for simple liquid? Rostova turned her intense gaze towards the nearest sensor aperture, locking on to the invisible presence of Xylos. The direct focus felt like a tangible push against his senses. "Observer, Xylos," she replied, her tone dropping, losing the diplomatic veneer. "You view our technology through the prism of Thracian efficiency. You calculate energy output versus projected kinetic effect. You miss the context." "Context is irrelevant to thermodynamics," Xylos countered, a slight edge entering his click speech. "To you, perhaps," Rostova shot back. "To us, context is survival." The tension in the room thickened. The Viridian delegate shifted uneasily. This was devolving from diplomacy into cultural antagonism, something the hegemony usually managed to avoid by simply overwhelming the opposing species with complex, irrefutable data streams. "Commander," Jnar interjected smoothly, attempting to diffuse the moment. "Perhaps you could illuminate us on this context. Show us why standard procedure cannot apply." Rostova glanced at the 4 sealed containers of ammunition. She didn't look towards the hegemony command vessels floating silent in the void, nor towards the Viridian monitors. She looked only at the container nearest her, a heavy steel crate labeled with a stylized droplet icon. "Fine," Rostova said, her voice now dangerously quiet. "We fear your advanced shields because they vaporize our projectiles before they hit. We fear your molecular scanners because they reveal everything. But what we rely on, what makes our small fleet viable against your hegemony, is the confidence of our core resource." She moved to the container, ignoring the warning chatter from the human security detail flanking her. She keyed in a complex override sequence onto the lock. The security detail immediately tensed, their carbines rising, but they did not intervene. "Observer Xylos, this entire confrontation is based on your assumption that because we require external propulsion, because we rely on chemical combustion, and because we use water as a weapon, we are technologically inferior." "The data supports this conclusion," Xylos stated, maintaining his detached observation posture. "The data is incomplete," Rostova retorted. She wrestled the heavy lid open, revealing not inert projectiles, but, surprised, thousands of individual vacuum-sealed pouches filled with the cloudy, mineral-rich fluid. She reached into the container, bypassing the specialized projectile shells, and grasped one of the sealed pouches, a fluid bag roughly the size of her own forearm. "You analyzed the projectile mass," Rostova continued, her eyes never leaving the sensor aperture where Xylos observed. "You calculated the kinetic energy of the stream. You failed to analyze the nature of the medium itself." She produced a small metallic device from a utility belt, a field cutter, designed to bypass standard energy shielding for demolition purposes. With a sharp, focused beam, she sliced through the vacuum seal of the pouch. A small, contained plume of the cloudy water hissed out into the filtered atmosphere of the negotiation chamber. It was instantly recognizable to the Xylos' sensorium. Biologically viable, slightly brackish water. Krell, back on the Stella Veritas, let out an audible, distressed screech. Prime, that is an atmospheric breach, trace organics, containment breach of level gamma material. Xylos ignored him. He was fixated on Commander Rostova. She did not flinch from the escaping vapor. She did not attempt to seal the breach. Instead, Commander Rostova did something that made the sophisticated, hyper-logical mind of Xylos seize up in surprised, sheer, unadulterated disbelief. She brought the punctured pouch to her mouth. "You view this as ammunition," Rostova stated, the words slightly muffled by the pouch pressed against her lips. "A medium for hurling brute force." She tilted her head back and, in a swift, decisive motion that defied every known principle of interstellar etiquette and safety protocol, Commander Eva Rostova, disgusted, drank the substance intended to be fired at hegemony cruisers. She swallowed a deep, shuddering intake of the impure liquid and then looked directly into the observation array, a slow, frighteningly confident smile spreading across her face. "We do not fear the hydrocannons, Observer Xylos," she finished, wiping a stray droplet from her chin with the back of her hand. "We fear what happens when you take away the only thing that keeps us running." The negotiation room went silent. Corell's plicking became erratic, bordering on incoherent panic. Xylos felt the cold vacuum of the void pressing in on him, not from outside, but from the terrifying void of the unknown that had just opened beneath his species' entire strategic assessment of the Terrans. The fluid they used as ammunition was not merely a propellant. It was something they needed to function, and they had just demonstrated a willingness to consume it in a hostile environment, right under the watchful eyes of the galaxy's self-appointed regulators. To drink the ammo, what unfathomable, terrifying necessity drove a species to treat its own weapon payload as an essential biological requirement? The strategic implications were catastrophic. They weren't just armed. They were fundamentally fueled by the very substance they projected as aggression. The fluid they used as ammunition was not merely a propellant. It was something they needed to function. And they had just demonstrated a willingness to consume it in a hostile environment, right under the watchful eyes of the galaxy's self-appointed regulators. Xylos felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the vacuum outside. His hydrostatic skeleton locked momentarily, every internal mechanism screaming against the sheer illogical violation of established physics. Drinking one's own projectile feedstock? It implied a dependency so profound, so primitive, that the hegemony had no established protocol for addressing it. On the stellar Veritas, Krell's distress signal spiked. "Observer Prime, initiate immediate withdrawal protocols. That substance is confirmed to contain active microbial life. She has introduced unknown bioagents into the controlled atmosphere of the Nexus Station corridor. This is a deliberate vector contamination." Xylos's three eyes snapped back to the main screen, focusing on Commander Rostova. She hadn't even blinked after swallowing. She seemed, if anything, energized, the tension around her mouthparts easing, replaced by a confident intensity that unnerved the hegemony more than any brute force attack. Ambassador Gnar, the Silicon diplomat, was the next to react. His crystalline facets, surprised, dimmed perceptibly, a reaction in Viridian circles akin to profound shock. The vibration that issued from him was not a whine, but a low, unsettling harmonic tremor. "Commander Rostova," Gnar stated, the common galactic translation struggling to convey the depth of the Silicon entity's dismay. "You have willfully introduced external biological contaminants into this sealed diplomatic environment.
Explain this action immediately, or the delegation must be sequestered. Rostova tossed the punctured, now empty pouch aside. It landed near the foot of the Viridian security detail with a dull, fleshy slap. "Sequestration is fine, Ambassador," Rostova said, her voice now carrying a resonant strength that hadn't been present moments before. She straightened, her posture losing the forced stiffness Xylos had noted earlier. "I needed to demonstrate the reality you refuse to acknowledge. You see efficiency, we see survival. My team is perfectly fine. We are adapted to the impurities of our home world." She then did something that shattered the remaining vestiges of Thracian detached observation. Rostova gestured sharply to the two human security officers beside her. "Jenkins, status check on core hydration levels." "Green, Commander," one of the officers replied, his voice crisp. "Internal recycling holding at 98% efficiency. Ambient ingestion successful." "Ambient ingestion successful?" Xylos projected, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting across the chamber. "You classify the deliberate consumption of weapon propellant as ambient ingestion?" Rostova finally turned her full attention to the invisible observer array, her eyes a vibrant, alarming shade of blue, seeming to pierce the observational hull plating of the station. "We are not utilizing weapon propellant, Observer Xylos. We are utilizing water. And yes, we ingest it, constantly. It is our universal solvent, our coolant, and the substrate for nearly all biological function. Your analysis showed impurities? Congratulations! That means it's earth water. We filter it, yes, but our tolerances are vast." She paused, letting the staggering implication sink in. "Your cruiser-class deterrence ships utilize passive resonance shielding, correct? Shields that convert incoming high-velocity kinetic impacts, like our water streams, into superheated steam." "That is accurate," Xylos confirmed cautiously. "And your internal systems," Rostova continued, leaning in mysteriously towards the sensor lens, "rely on ultra-pure conductive matrices, hermetically sealed environments, and specialized cryocoolants that destabilize rapidly if subjected to thermal shock or excessive moisture infiltration." Rostova snapped her fingers, a startling sharp sound in the pressurized silence. "Our hydro cannons don't just fire water to damage the hull, Xylos. They fire water because your shields vaporize it into plasma hot enough to overload your sensitive energy systems." This was known. Predictable attrition warfare. The hegemony understood this basic principle. What they did not understand was the, second layer of the human strategy. "But that doesn't explain the ingestion, Commander," Xylos pressed. "Why drink it?" "Because the energy required to synthesize, refine, and maintain the purity of your coolant systems across light years of travel is astronomical," Rostova countered. "We don't have that luxury. We carry our life support with us. And in a prolonged engagement, carrying sufficient pure water for cooling and internal regulation becomes impossible. So we adapt." She tapped her temple lightly. "When we can't access pure H2O, we utilize what we have. The hydrocannon ammo is heavily filtered and mineralized, yes, but crucially, it is recycled water from our own biological output, trace elements included, before being repressurized and chemically balanced for weapon output. It's a closed-loop system of necessity." This was the moment Xylos realized the fearful horror of the Terran existence. They weren't just technologically limited, they were fundamentally resource-scarce in a way the hegemony, which drew limitless energy from the quantum vacuum, could not fathom.
They were so constrained by their biology that their logistics chain, the thing the hegemony had mocked, was actually the surprised key to their resilience. You are suggesting, Xylos managed, his internal processor struggling to model the feedback loop, that the fluid you utilize for deterrence is also your primary resource for internal systemic maintenance? I'm suggesting, Rostova corrected, her voice hardening, that if you attack us, you aren't just hitting a target. You are attacking a recycling pump. And if you succeed in disabling our ability to project the water, you simultaneously risk triggering a system-wide failure caused by deprivation of the same resource. This presented a grotesque strategic paradox. Attacking the human fleet meant causing the humans to potentially consume their reserves faster, but also meant the humans would starve for the very substance they needed to keep their hyper-advanced yet fragile shipboard reactors from overheating or their biosystems from catastrophic shutdown. Before Xylos could process the ramifications of weaponized biological dependency, the negotiation room escalated again. Ambassador Gnar, recovering from the initial shock, made a fateful decision. He perceived Rostova's demonstration not as explanation, but as aggressive intimidation, a threat utilizing controlled biological warfare. "This provocation is unacceptable," Gnar resonated, his voice now sharp with silicon indignation. The hegemony observer was correct to be cautious. Terrans have shown a capacity for weaponizing fundamental necessity. Negotiating terms are suspended. Security details prepare for tactical disengagement and quarantine enforcement. The moment Gar signaled the station monitors to activate the localized dampening field, a procedure designed to freeze all non-essential local systems, the humans reacted with aggressive, predatory speed. "Oh, for the love of Earth's oceans," Rostova muttered, dropping her diplomatic pretense entirely. The two human security officers, Jenkins and his partner, moved. They didn't raise their carbines or deploy personal shields. They dropped low in a fluid, coordinated motion that belied their lumbering appearance. Jenkins produced a small, polished metallic cylinder, a piece of gear Xylos had logged as an emergency signaling beacon, and threw it precisely at the nearest Viridian security console. It didn't explode. It hissed, releasing a plume of dense white vapor. "Cryofoam deployment!" Jenkins shouted, his voice crackling with static. The vapor was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't an explosive, it was a high-density thermal sink. In the vacuum-tolerant environments of the Nexus station, where heat dissipation was managed by intricate radiant panels, this localized cloud of near-absolute zero foam latched onto the Viridian consoles and external heat sinks with terrifying efficiency. For the silicon-based Viridians, heat was lifeblood, the medium of their computations. The console emitting Ginar's quarantine signal immediately sputtered. The crystalline facets around the terminal dimmed rapidly, darkening from translucent amber to opaque charcoal. "Thermal shutdown initiated on Sector 3!" Krell shrieked over the link, finally cutting through Xylos' stunned silence. "Observer Prime! The Terrans are initiating localized environmental compromise! Their secondary gear is designed to manipulate thermal gradients!" Xylos watched, horrified, as Rostova's team moved with the grace of practiced predators. They weren't deploying advanced phase weaponry. They were exploiting fundamental thermodynamic laws with utterly barbaric simplicity. "They are using temperature differentials against you, Ambassador!" Xylos broadcasted urgently to Gnar. "Disengage localized dampeners!
Their foam is exploiting the differential between your operational temperature and the ambient shield buffer. Gnar attempted to override the shutdown command, but the sudden, massive thermal shock, the equivalent of instantly flash freezing a highly complex active circuit, had locked his system controls. Rostova didn't wait for the Viridians to recover. She strode toward the main docking airlock, the only direct route back to her escort vessel. "My terms are simple now," Rostova called out, her voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. "You immediately retract the Sol system quarantine, or my team will begin prioritizing the thermal collapse of every unsecured system within a kilometer radius of this negotiation chamber." Xylos finally broke his paralysis. This was not the clumsy display of a burgeoning species. This was precision strategic warfare leveraging unexpected vectors. They were forcing the hegemony to confront a reality where their supreme advantage, control over complex energy manipulation, was suddenly a weakness. "Commander Rostova, stand down!" Xylos projected, pouring every ounce of his authority into the transmission.
The hegemony does not yield to coercion under threat of localized infrastructure collapse. That is a violation of Universal Contact Statute 409B. Rostova stopped at the airlock threshold. She turned, and in her hand she was no longer holding a signaling beacon. She held a clear, pressurized canister, a miniature version of the hydrocannon rounds, but clearly designed for manual deployment. Statute 409B applies to species engaging in equitable conflict, Xylos. You have spent 3 cycles treating us like a sarcastic petri dish to be isolated or sterilized. We are not a petri dish. We are a furnace fueled by biological necessity, and we have just shown you the ignition source. She held up the canister. Inside, the water was agitated, swirling violently. "This," she said, her voice dropping to a mysterious level of intensity, "is standard issue sidearm propellant. It requires minimal charge to rupture. And if I breach this canister against the hull reinforcement here, the resultant micro-steam explosion will overload the local gravity stabilizers for this entire orbital sector." Xylos analyzed the projection instantly. Such an uncontrolled rupture, even small scale, would send the entire Nexus Prime station into a chaotic, unpredictable tumble within the nebula's gravity well, a catastrophe that would certainly destroy the hegemony's critical sensor hub located just beyond the primary defense perimeter. "The collateral damage profile is unacceptable," Xylos Desperate admitted, the admission tasting like ozone and failure. He was forced to concede the immediate tactical advantage. The hegemony could not afford to lose the sensor hub. "Acceptable to whom?" Rostova challenged. "You value your remote infrastructure over the lives of the delegates here. We value immediate survival. The quarantine ends now, observer. We leave and we go home. You lift the blockade, or we start drinking the ship dry and vaporizing your orbital furniture piece by piece until you comply." Xylos looked at Krell, whose chiton was now a sad, uniform, dull gray, the color of Thracian despair. The prognostics models were useless. Every equation based on energy input and technological scaling had failed when confronted by a species that used their own lifeblood as both weapon and resource. "Krell," Xylos commanded, his voice subdued. "Prepare the official hegemony channels. Issue the immediate retraction of the Sol system quarantine order. cite unforeseen systemic incompatibility as the official reason for policy reversal. But, Observer Prime, the Grand Council will be informed that the Terran species operates on principles fundamentally incompatible with our current understanding of thermodynamic resource allocation. We will not engage until a full reassessment of their biological requirements, specifically their ingestion requirements, can be modeled. Xylos paused, watching Rostova step back, a tired, almost weary victory etched on her face. We must understand why they drink their ammunition. Rostova nodded once, confident. Good decision, Xylos. We'll be waiting for the official notice. She secured the sidearm canister back on her belt. Jenkins, prepare the exit vector. We are done negotiating with the things that, sarcastic, fear a little humility. As the two security officers activated the external airlock controls, Rostova paused one last time at the threshold, addressing the unseen Thracian observer one final time. One last thing, Xylos. You called our technology crude. You called our reliance on mass transit archaic. She smiled, and it wasn't friendly. When we leave, you will notice something about the atmosphere in this chamber. You noted the trace organics, the amino acids, the minerals we need to survive. Xylos activated the environmental sensors immediately. The readings were spiking wildly, microbial counts far above acceptable limits, even accounting for the initial breach. "What have you done?" Xylos demanded, a sense of disgusted, true, species-level violation creeping over him. "We didn't just drink the water, Observer," Rostova said, the airlock cycling open behind her, revealing the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space outside. "We seeded the atmosphere with the byproducts of that ingestion. We filtered the most volatile, resilient bacterial strains from our own digestive systems and released them into your pristine air supply." She stepped out onto the docking ramp, the airlock door hissing shut behind her, isolating the compromised chamber. "You wanted context for our biodependency? Here it is. If we need water to survive, we also generate waste we need to expel. And right now, Observer Prime, your sophisticated sensorium, your beautiful, efficient Thracian architecture, and every square inch of this station are breathing in the microscopic remnants of Commander Rostova's lunch." The feed went silent as the human escort craft detached with a burst of chemical thrust. Xylos stared at the environmental readouts flashing crimson across his console. An infestation of microscopic life, complex, adaptive, and utterly foreign, now loose in the hegemony's most secure diplomatic nexus. The hegemony had worried about kinetic impacts, about thermal overloads and molecular disintegration. They had failed to account for the single most fearful, terrifying strategic element the humans possessed: their own biology, weaponized by necessity. Capable of turning sophisticated technology into a mere delivery system for highly specialized, highly aggressive contamination. The quarantine was lifted, but the fearful war had just begun. Fought now not with light-speed projectiles, but with the invisible, pervasive armies that rode the very air the Thracians needed to process their own flawed logic. Xylos looked at Krell, who was now frantically running decontamination algorithms against an unknown, evolving threat profile. "Krell," Xylos whispered, his click of his voice barely audible over the alarm klaxons starting to rise through the Stellara Veritas.
Initiate full atmospheric purge on the station. Then synthesize 40,000 liters of the Terran fluid. I need to know exactly what we are fighting. Prepare the sampling equipment. We are going to analyze the contamination vector up close. He knew the risk. To analyze the biological weapon meant exposure to the source.
But to retreat now, to allow this biological infiltration to spread unchecked through hegemony space, was unthinkable. And Krell, Xylos added, his obsidian eyes hardening with terrible resolve, the first seed of human-like defiance taking root in his logical core. Ensure that the synthesized liquid is stored in containment units rated for high-pressure ingestion. We must understand precisely how much of this water it takes to make a human function. And Krell, Xylos added, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of the alarm klaxons that now pulsed through the Stellara Veritas. Ensure that the synthesized liquid is stored in containment units rated for high-pressure ingestion. We must understand precisely how much of this water it takes to make a human function. Krell, his carapace vibrating with a mixture of terror and professional urgency,
Hastily began rerouting power matrices to the primary biosynthesis core. Understood, Observer Prime, initiating rapid synthesis of high-mineral H2O analog. Simulation models suggest a 98% purity correlation with the recovered projectile residue, but the biological activity indicators are spiking uncontrollably on the Nexus Station sensors. We are detecting complex lipid chains and active bacterial colonies in the atmospheric recirculation vents. Xylos didn't look at Krell. He stared at the main screen, which now displayed the Odyssey-class escort drifting slowly away from the contaminated nexus point, already engaging its rudimentary fusion drives for interstellar transit. Commander Rostova had won the first battle, not with superior firepower, but with superior contamination. Desperate purity is irrelevant now, Krell, Xylos stated, the cold calculation returning, overlaid with a strange, new desperation. We are dealing with organisms whose baseline environment is, by our standards, toxic sludge. Their resilience is inversely proportional to our need for perfection. We were so focused on the delivery mechanism, the kinetic blast, that we entirely missed the fuel mechanism. They didn't just bring water, they brought their internal plumbing system and flushed it into our pristine environment. The hegemony operated on the principle of optimization. If something was inefficient, it was discarded or refined into obsolescence. Humans, driven by sheer biological necessity to survive on a volatile world, had optimized themselves around inefficiency. Their reliance on volatile chemical processes, their need for constant, impure hydration, these were not flaws in their technology. They were defining characteristics of their species, weaponized through sheer stubborn persistence. Xylos initiated a Level 5 lockdown protocol on the Stellare Veritas, sealing off all environmental conduits that had interfaced with the station's main diagnostic hub. He had to know the limits of this biological attack before the Grand Council, already demanding explanations for the diplomatic collapse, returned a verdict of catastrophic failure. Hours bled into cycles as the Thracian Engineering Corps worked frantically to replicate the Terran ammunition and test its interaction with standard Thracian biological analogs. When the synthesized fluid, now a murky, slightly effervescent batch that made Krell, disgusted, visibly shudder, was ready, Xylos ordered the analysis moved to a fully sealed, isolated test bay, far from any sensitive circuitry. "We will not risk systemic contamination across the fleet, Prime," Krell insisted, hovering near the bay's reinforced shield partition. "We must analyze the organic component remotely." "We will analyze it by immersion, analyst," Xylos countered.
The decision made with chilling clarity. If their survival hinges on ingesting this substance, then our defense must hinge on understanding the symbiotic relationship. We cannot fight a species whose primary weapon is also its required nutrient. He directed the bay's automated manipulators to prepare a specialized Thracian-scale testing apparatus, a sealed environment normally used to test the corrosive limits of exotic antimatter solvents on specialized alloys. Into this chamber, they placed a synthetic Thracian analog, a complex, self-repairing crystalline matrix designed to simulate Xylos's own biomechanical structure, complete with microcapillaries simulating nutrient flow. The synthesized water analog, their crude imitation of Earth's H2O, was carefully introduced. Initially, nothing dramatic happened. The crystalline analog showed slight structural fatigue, minor discoloration where the suspended minerals adhered to the matrix surface. It was inefficient, messy, but not immediately lethal. Structural fatigue registered at 0.03% over baseline, Krell reported mechanically. Negligible corrosive action against the primary substrate. Increase the hydrostatic pressure by a factor of 10, Xylos ordered. Simulate weapon discharge conditions. The manipulators whined, pressurizing the chamber until the fluid inside achieved pressures sufficient to punch through a blade of armor plating. The synthetic Thracian analog immediately began to buckle. The external crystalline structures, designed for maximum tensile strength and vacuum, fractured under the sheer, unrelenting hydraulic stress. But it wasn't the pressure that destroyed it, it was the secondary effect. As the pressurized fluid moved through the matrix's simulated capillaries, the trace organic elements, the lipids and residual amino acids, began to aggregate. In the high-pressure, high-flow environment, they formed minute, sticky biofilms that clogged the hyper-efficient nutrient pathways. Prime, system flow disruption registering at 90% across all arterial analogs. Krell clicked in horror. The trace organic load is acting as an internal, non-reactive clogging agent. It stops the energy transfer systems from functioning. The crystalline analog, starved of the refined vacuum energy substrate it required, began to dim. Its internal luminescence, the signature of active Thracian life functions, faded to a dull, sickly gray, the same color as Krell's carapace during moments of extreme anxiety. Xylos watched the simulated death of his species' perfection. The humans weren't just attacking their shields, they were exploiting the very purity of Thracian existence. Thracians required refined, precise, ultra-clean energy input. Humans required messy, contaminated sludge to survive and fight. They weaponized their biological need for inefficiency? Xylos murmured, absorbing the magnitude of the realization. When your hydrocannons impact, the resulting plasma surge destroys the shields. But the water that remains, the water that saturates the hull and finds its way into any breach, doesn't corrode the systems. It clogs them. It fills the fine channels with the biological detritus they thrive on. The humans had designed a system where the residual byproduct of their necessary resource intake became the fatal contaminant for a species that had spent millennia purifying itself. It was a horrifying, elegant paradox. Krell, what if we neutralize the organic component? Xylos asked, a desperate edge to his command. If we synthesize the water, but sterilize it completely, remove every trace of those lipids and microbes,
Would it still be an effective propellant? Krell ran the simulations instantly.
Affirmative, Observer Prime. The kinetic projection remains viable. However, the resulting pure H2O, upon impact with a hypercharged resonance shield, would flash into superheated steam, precisely as before. It would be a cleaner but equally destructive plasma burst. Then we have two options, Xylos stated, moving to the bridge's command console. 1. We match their kinetic output with our own, accepting the plasma backsplash, and fight a resource war they are biologically better equipped to handle. 2. We exploit the core weakness they just demonstrated. And what is that, Prime? Krell asked, trembling. Their dependence on the fluid, Xylos said, his three eyes focusing with renewed, terrifying clarity. They need it to cool their reactors, to sustain their biology, and to fire their weapons. It is their singular, finite, logistic line. The Hegerony commanded entire stellar nurseries.
They could synthesize whatever they needed, wherever they needed it. The humans were defined by limits. Krell, divert all available energy from non-essential sensor arrays and auxiliary life support. We are not engaging in kinetic warfare. We are engaging in logistics starvation. Xylos knew the Grand Council would hate this. It was passive, it was slow, and it offered no immediate glorious victory. But it was the only way to defeat a species that was stronger because it was weaker. He opened a direct channel to the Hegemony Strategic Command overseeing the region. Grand Council, this is Observer Prime Xylos. My assessment of Terran capabilities has undergone a fundamental revision. The hydrocannons are secondary. The Terran species is the primary weapon. Their tactical resilience is predicated upon the continuous recycling and utilization of biological necessity, specifically H2O. He projected the data from the test bay, the simulation of the Thracian analog choking on trace organics. The data confirms that extended conflict will exhaust their finite supply of ingestible propellant, leading to systemic failure through both resource depletion and internal bioinstability when they are forced to consume highly refined, ultra-pure, non-biological coolants. The Council's response was instantaneous, a wave of angry, cold digital disapproval. Engage with overwhelming force. Neutralize the source of contamination. Council, no! Xylos countered, overriding their automated response matrix with a level 7 override, a procedure almost never used outside of civil war scenarios. We engage them now kinetically, and we risk catastrophic system failure due to bioagent saturation. We must isolate their logistics first. Xylos bypassed the command structure entirely. Utilizing the emergency deployment parameters established during the initial quarantine, he ordered the remaining 5 cruiser-class deterrents currently maintaining perimeter vigilance to execute a serious, unprecedented maneuver. Cruisers Delta through Omega, Xylos projected across the secure fleet net. Execute Operation Drought. Deploy full-spectrum radiation saturation across the entire Sol system boundary. Not as a blockade, as a vaporizer. Every exposed molecule of H2O vapor in their primary travel lanes, their orbital defense buffers, and any known deep space storage caches must be bombarded with high-intensity, targeted microradiation to induce immediate molecular excitation and subsequent atmospheric diffusion. This was not a blockade intended to stop ships. It was an aggressive, environmental attack designed to strip the stars bare of accessible water vapor within the hegemony's operational sphere. It was a colossal waste of energy, but against a species defined by thirst, it was the only path to victory. Krell watched the power drain on the main grid, his carapace twitching nervously. Prime, the energy expenditure for such a wide-spectrum molecular excitation field is astronomical. It will cripple our jump capabilities for cycles. It will cripple them first, analyst, Xylos said, the sheer audacity of the strategy feeling like a perverse form of enlightenment. They cannot fight without their water. We starve them of the raw material, and the hegemony will not need to fire a single kinetic round. They will simply run out of things to drink. For the next standard rotation, the hegemony fleet became a constellation of massive microwave emitters. The Cygnus Veil, once a backdrop for diplomatic farce, became the stage for the universe's largest atmospheric scrubbing operation. The Odyssey-class escort, already distant, began transmitting distress signals. Not weapon lock alarms, but frantic, internal telemetry readouts. The human ship's internal recycling systems were straining to compensate, their limited onboard stores being rapidly depleted to sustain the pilots and reactors. On the Stellare Veritas, Xylos monitored the escalating chaos within the distant human vessel. He watched as the humans, unable to draw replenishment from the void, were forced into increasingly desperate measures. The telemetry showed them diverting reactor coolant, the ultra-pure H2O replacement they feared, into their life support systems, pushing their reactors past safe thermal tolerances. The final transmission came 18 hours later. It was not a declaration of war, nor a surrender. It was a final, garbled audio log, captured before the human escort's internal systems finally failed under the strain of self-poisoning and heat exhaustion. The voice was Commander Rostova's. Strained, cracking, but undeniably present. Hull integrity failing, reactor core fluctuating, can't synthesize fast enough. The air is dry, too clean. Jenkins is trying to reroute the last reserves, but we can't maintain cycle pressure. Xylos won. He starved us. Then, a sound that ripped through the Thracian logic processors, a desperate, hacking cough, followed by a low, guttural moan of profound biological distress. The transmission cut out as the ship's primary power grid collapsed, not from plasma fire, but from catastrophic overheating caused by forcing high-purity, non-biological coolant through systems optimized only for contaminated slurry. The war was over. It had been won not by superior force, but by recognizing that an enemy's weakness, their dependence on fragile, easily exhausted resources, could be magnified into an existential threat by denying them the very environment they had adapted to thrive in. Krell approached Xylos, his carapace regaining some of its natural deep sapphire sheen, though tinged with exhaustion. "Observer Prime," Krell began softly. "The Sol system blockade is lifted. The Terran vessel is inert, drifting. We have achieved total strategic victory without kinetic engagement." Xylos deactivated the array, focusing on the dead human vessel. He felt no triumph, only a profound, unsettling emptiness. The fear of the hydrocannons had been based on a misunderstanding of their purpose. The true weapon was thirst. "We won, Krell, by proving that we can exploit the things they must desperately guard," Xylos said slowly,
tapping the control surface where the synthesized, murky water sample was still sealed in its containment unit.
We defeated them by demonstrating that their greatest strength, their ability to survive on filth, is inextricably linked to their greatest weakness, their absolute, unyielding need for that filth. He looked at the sample, the cloudy liquid that represented the entire strategic reassessment of the hegemony. They hadn't defeated a superior force. They had defeated a desperate ecosystem fighting for its very habitat. The Grand Council will be satisfied with the logistical victory, Xylos continued, standing up from his command couch. They will see the threat neutralized. But we must record this finding with absolute clarity, analyst. Xylos walked to the environmental bay containing the test simulation. The crystalline analog was inert, coated in the sticky residue of the mineralized water, a permanent testament to the near-fatal encounter. Record this. The Terran species is not technologically primitive.
They are biologically optimized for resource scarcity, a condition we, in our abundance, can never truly replicate or understand. He paused, taking one last look at the dead human ship displayed on the holographic remnant of the main screen, a blocky, blunt vessel that had managed to bring the masters of the galaxy to their knees through nothing more than basic fluid dynamics and profound biological dependency. They do not fear purity, Krell. They fear dryness. They fear the absence of their messy, impure world. Xylos turned away from the screen, facing the cold, logical expanse of the hegemony fleet waiting for his orders. We will maintain minimal surveillance on the Sol system, but we will not integrate them. They are too volatile, too rooted in concepts that defy systemic logic. And Krell, he added, a strange, faint resonance entering his own clicks, the first sign of something akin to humility in the hegemony leadership. For the sake of our own long-term health, order the construction of specialized, high-capacity, closed-loop atmospheric recyclers for every vessel. And commission a new line of Thracian tactical analysis, the thermodynamics of thirst. We must never again assume that the most basic components of life are irrelevant to interstellar dominance. He settled back into his command chair, the silence of the bridge profound, no longer humming with efficiency, but thick with the weight of a fearful, newly learned, terrifying truth. The galaxy was far stranger and far thirstier than the Thracian hegemony had ever dared to imagine.